This time on Poll Hub, we're asking the age-old question, why is Congress so unpopular? Well, actually, we're asking why the perennially unpopular body is so much less popular than it was roughly a year ago. Then we have a special guest to help us work through data about seniors and tech. You know, young and old, we all have a story about seniors using cell phones or tablets or PCs or home cameras. Alexa, hey, hi Siri, etc., etc. But it turns out something has changed in this relationship during the pandemic. We're going to talk about it. Finally, we end with a fun fact that only seniors, like Gus, will even understand. Ooh, that hurts. The sooner we get to it, the sooner we can take our naps, though. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Maringhoff.
One of the topics we're going to talk about today is the Congress and why it is so unpopular. I think one of the more surprising things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, though, is that as Americans have focused their attention on Ukraine, is actually cooperation of Democrats and Republicans in Congress to support Ukraine and actually to move and get things done with great haste. Unfortunately, that's something quite unusual for those legislative bodies. And for anyone who's been watching the confirmation hearings in the Senate for the Supreme Court, you realize, of course, that has also been something that has been very short-lived. Congress hasn't been held in high esteem by Americans for quite a long time. And that's likely due in part to the fact that, well, it's the place where much of the government sausage gets made. So it's where issues and legislation, when we're actually talking about those things, gets hashed out and debated. But there was a brief moment when Gallup's congressional approval rating hit 36% in early 2021. I suspect that was about the time when Congress was taking significant steps to respond to COVID. But now it's half that. And back to its low 18%, not the lowest, but certainly the low. So what happened in just 1 year?
Hey, and Lee, before you jump into that, because I think this is really interesting, it's not, like you mentioned, Barb, it's not like Congress has ever been super popular, but there was a period from the late 90s into the early 2000s where it was at 50%. I actually don't remember 50% of anybody in a poll, 50% liking Congress. I thought it had always been like 20%. But there was that period, but since early 2003, it's been below 50% and a solid decline. This 36%, though, is the highest it was since 2009. So this really was remarkable, this 36%, as low as that seems. It's kind of a low bar to be excited about, but now it's back down to 18%, which is kind of where it's been for the last decade. Anyway, Lee, what's going on?
I was just going to say, to your point, Jay, I was just going to say the 1990s were the Clinton-Gingrich battles and the closing of the government at one point. And I think what happened during that time is there was movement, there was responsiveness, but it was chaotic nonetheless. So I think that may have been what was going on.
So what's happened? Why have we gone from 36 to 18% in 1 year?
Well, I would argue, first of all, Congress seems to perennially be less popular even than presidents are. So, I mean, we have this kind of like oddity where we're focusing on the best of Congress is still lower than the worst of what presidents have pretty much had. But I think, what's happened last year is, first of all, the Democrats took control of both houses of Congress, the House and both chambers, the House and the Senate. And although the margins are the slimmest of possible, even in the Senate and 5 or 6 seats, depending on who retired and what, in the House, the discussion has been the epitome of an inside the beltway discussion. I mean, process has dominated. Is Manchin going to go with the Democrats? Is, with Biden's program, is Manchin not going to go with Biden's program? That's not real for the public. That's sort of like, as I say, the epitome of inside the beltway talk. People are dealing with real things. They're dealing with COVID. They're dealing with, the economy. They're worried about now Ukraine. And we're seeing even this week this horrible process of selecting a Supreme Court judge, which has become so partisan too. So I think Congress has sort of like overstayed its welcome in terms of its inability to move things along in terms of the agenda. Barbara, you were going to say something before.
Well, just before I was going to just mention, which you pointed out, which is that a high approval rating for Congress is still a pitiful approval rating for any candidate or executive. Certainly, 36% for a governor or a president would be something that would attract a lot of opponents when that office holder was thinking about re-election. But moving on, 94.7% of House incumbents won back their seats in 2020. And it is actually expected that a similar number is going to do the same thing in 2022. So I think one question I have is, why the disconnect? And what are the implications of that for our midterm elections?
I mean, I think people hold their own Congress. I think we've seen this historically, that people see a body, an amorphous body, and say, blame them. It's easy. It's easy to blame something amorphous. But then when it's personal, and not that a Congress person is personal, but it is your person. It's the person you're voting for. It's the person you see in your, in your news and you hear about. That's different. So I can blame Congress for not being able to agree on anything, get anything done. But my guy or my woman, she's good for us. She got the road paved. She got this, she got that. And I think that disconnect is partly explained in these numbers, the approval numbers versus the incumbency. But it also points to me to a failure on the part of Congress and maybe congressional leadership to convey and to carry forward the popularity of individual candidates or individual House members or senators into the body as a whole. Maybe it's not a priority. Maybe they don't care. I mean, if you get elected, re-elected, who cares if the whole body's not popular? But it seems like there's a failure to bring forward that popularity or approval into the body as a whole.
Yeah, and I think also we've seen an increase in partisanship, which seems an ironic thing because Congress has always been partisan. But right now, we've got red districts getting redder, blue districts getting bluer, and fewer kind of swing districts, which are up for grabs. So this notion that almost everybody who doesn't retire or doesn't get a huge scandal makes it back is not surprising, in that their districts are getting better and better and better for them, of whichever party they happen to be. The purple districts are getting squeezed out and fewer and far between.
Is there value, Barb, in doing these polls and getting congressional approval rating?
Well, hang on just a second, because I don't want you guys to miss the second part of my question, which is what does this really mean for 2022? We're talking about a slim margin in the House, the slimmest of margins in the Senate. But if Congress people pretty much get reelected, what does that mean for how we've seen the changes over the last several cycles in Congress from Democrat to Republican?
Well, what we've seen in modern times is that the average loss for the House party, meaning the party of the president and the president's party in the House, has been 22 seats in their president's first midterm election, and the average loss for the president's party in the Senate has been 3 seats. Now, with fewer seats up for grabs, those numbers may even exaggerate what's likely to happen in 2022. But then again, because of, as I mentioned earlier, the slimmest of margins for the Democrats, it doesn't take more than one Senate flip to change the Senate chamber, and it doesn't take more than a half a dozen House seats to change the House, and you've got plenty of retirements and some redistricting that can create that. So don't expect a massive swing, but it's not going to take a lot to change the way the government is organized in the Congress.
I think there is value in asking these questions. As we pointed out, there are high watermarks, and I think it is interesting, and I think it's important to emphasize that when Congress acts, the American people notice.
And I think the other lesson you could draw from this is that Democrats are the ones who are driving this from 36 to 18%. It's Democrats who have, by and large, said, yeah, we're not so fond of Congress as we were a year ago. That may translate into a lack of intensity of support in 2022. That may be a read and a value in this kind of poll as well, is to see that intensity of support. I mean, there's a lot of ways to measure it, but that may be one.
Just a last point from my seat here is that, and if you don't think Congress has gotten more partisan, take a look at the Senate hearings and what's going on right now, and think back not too long ago when Antonin Scalia vote in the Senate was 98-0 on his confirmation. You couldn't get 98 for I don't know what right now.
Well, I don't think we even got that for Ukraine, if I recall.
No. There's no point. These things are even Steven, Democrats and Republicans.
So let's change gears and talk about something that we've actually had a lot of experience with, which is seniors and technology. And the reason that we wanted to talk about this now is that there's a number of research studies and surveys that we've seen come out about the nature of seniors and their use of technology and their desire to use it effectively and more, but also some of the changes that have happened because of the pandemic. And I think anybody who's lived through this last 2 years and has anybody in their life who's a senior understands probably instinctively that there have been some changes in these relationships, simply because it's the only way we've been able to communicate is to use some of these technology devices. So to help us through some of this, we thought it would be good to bring on somebody who knows more about this than we do. So we want to welcome to the show Jay Olshansky, who is a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he's also the chief scientist at Lapitus Solutions. Jay, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So one of the studies we looked at showed that adults 65 and older have a very strong desire to use technology, but they lack the know-how to do so. Has that changed in the last year or 2 years during the pandemic that you've seen?
Well, probably by force, it's changed. I would imagine some people, the only way in which they can communicate with their kids or their grandkids is by Zoom or some other online technology. During the height of the pandemic, we were having our holidays completely online. So all of us had to learn, however old we are. I happen to be 68, so I guess by definition, I'm one of your seniors. We all had to learn, a technology that perhaps we were unfamiliar with. So it's not like you can't learn a new technology regardless of how old you are. And I'm sure COVID forced that upon us in a very short time period. I will say, by the way, keep in mind that you have to take into account the generational effect of understanding and using technology. So the people that are over 65 that you would qualify as seniors, we grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but in another decade or so, that's all going to change because you're going to have another group that makes it out to this older age range that is more technologically savvy than the previous generation. So with each generation, you will see greater technological savvy in older generations.
So the gap is going to, by definition, narrow in terms of people's ability to. I'm 70, so I'm probably not liking this example too much, but I do understand the statistical background for it.
Just keep in mind, senior is 10 years older than you are. So I was going to ask you what you meant by a senior, by the way, but you defined it as 65 and over. I happen to be 68. You'll soon realize once you get more into the dynamics of human aging and longevity, and you actually get there yourself, you'll realize, it doesn't really matter. It's just a number. It is associated with an increased risk for certain things, but there are people that make it out into their 70s, 80s, 90s that are no different than people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I actually attended a meeting with a group of they're called super agers, who are studied, by the way, at Northwestern University. These super agers are people who are 80 and over, who are cognitively intact and operating at levels that are decades younger than their chronological age. I sat around a table with them. You close your eyes, they're all pulling out all kinds of electronic technology. They're operating at the level of somebody that's decades younger. So it just depends on your personal background and history and whether or not you're a super ager.
You just made me feel a whole lot better. Go on, Barb.
I was just going to mention that Lee has always been a Luddite. So, when it comes to technology, he's always seemed to have an aversion to it. He's fond of saying that as a youngster, he was brought into IBM to take a look at their latest technology back in the 60s, the computer. And he could take it or leave it. It wasn't really his thing. But my question is this. I mean, granted, as people age out, and as the seniors of the future do have more of a background in these technologies, but technology is still going to change. How we approach it, kind of the paradigm of technology will be different. Is the difficulty that seniors have with technology more about the fact that it's a kind of a different paradigm that they need to experience, or is it also about the fact that technology companies really don't market to them, and so the user experience doesn't really bring them along, so to speak? So I was just curious what your research, might, how your research might, enlighten that.
So think of it this way. Look, this applies to every technology. Anytime something new is developed, some type of new device, some new software, whatever it is, if in order for people to use it, they have to learn it, and they have to learn how it operates. Do not get the false impression that people that are older can't learn. And I was detecting a little bit of ageism, whether intentional or not, in what you were saying, by coming to the conclusion that it's more difficult for older people. It's not. Whether or not younger individuals can adapt to new technologies, I think that's the thing, is that younger individuals have, in some levels, in some degree, more experience. They've been closer to these technological changes than older individuals. But older individuals, they could be 70, 80, 90. There's no reason why they can't learn new technologies. Maybe some of the companies that are developing them are not catering to them, and they're not finding ways to communicate with them as effectively, because you would talk to an 80 or a 90-year-old differently than you would talk to a 30 or a 40-year-old, or my grandson who's 7 years old. You would talk to him differently. And so you really need to focus in on a generational approach, but there's no reason why somebody at a later age can't learn new technology just like somebody at a younger age.
I'm curious if part of this is this paradigm shift that Barb has talked about. So though all of us have, for instance, or probably I think all of us, experienced punch cards for computers, right? That's something that if you showed a punch card to anybody who's young and on TikTok and gets technology would not understand. They don't even probably have a concept of what a punch card would be used for. So we, as older adults, have technological experiences that are fundamentally different. But technology, one of the things that I think has happened a lot, and we've seen this during the pandemic, is that technology has been moving, especially personal tech, has been moving to eliminate the barriers to use and entry. I think about voice, for instance, to just be able to talk to your house and have it do everything. Do you think that there is a fundamental shift in technology that over the course of the next couple of decades may lower this difference between younger and older people's ability to adapt to new tech, since the tech itself is easier and friendlier to use, both voice tech, self-driving cars, all this kind of stuff?
It's a good question. Maybe. My answer would be a little different. I have a sneaking suspicion that the organizations that are developing this new tech are going to realize where all the money is. All the money is in the older generation. It's not in the younger generation. And as soon as they figure out where the money is, they're going to cater to the subgroup of the population that has the money, which is us, those of us that are over 60 or 65. And they'll figure out that maybe they ought to figure out how to communicate their technology to us first, or at least us for sure, as part of that equation. The other part of your question, I think, is an interesting one, which is, for example, self-driving cars and, using photographs or voice technology. It's all getting easier and simpler. And of course, that's going to help people of all ages, whether you're young or old. I wouldn't automatically assume that because something is simpler and easier, it's more beneficial to somebody who's older. It's just more beneficial in general. If somebody happens to be reluctant to use new technology because they're a Luddite, using your language, they're perhaps less willing or able, you've just opened up a channel to them.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's funny because we talk about these generational differences, but I think we all approach technology in a very similar way. And let me just explain. When we were, we give a summer pre-college course for rising juniors and seniors, and we often joke, that grandma or grandpa will refer to the Google as if it's, as if it's a thing. But these high schoolers, which I found quite amusing, refer to the TV as if it was something which was also foreign and something that they didn't really grasp. So I think that's a really good point, that very often we really are, very similar in how we approach it. It's just what we see as familiar or not.
I was out to dinner with my daughter, my son-in-law, and my grandson, who's 7 years old. My grandson at dinner last night was calling his mom and dad basically computer or statistical or technological Luddites. And I was laughing hysterically at this, because that's exactly what my kids did to my wife and I when they were younger. And so you see it in every single generation. The youngest generation thinks of, I'm waiting for my grandson to ask his parents, did they have cars and airplanes and televisions when you were younger, which is the question I used to ask my parents. My kids asked us, and now my grandson is asking his parents.
So just hand them a punch card and say, so exactly what would you do with this?
Or a rotary dial telephone.
Our phone booths. Jay, before we let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, your interest in this field, the motivation, did that start when you were much younger, or as you got older? Did you suddenly say, I'm going to find out a little bit more about this ageism stuff?
It actually started when I was in graduate school, and I took a class from a famous professor by the name of Bernice Newgarden, who then went to Northwestern University, and she, knew that I had an interest in demography, but my interest at the time was in adolescent fertility. And she had just published a book on whether or not we should be trying to manipulate the human lifespan. And she wanted to know what I thought. And so she gave me an assignment. I went to the library. I didn't leave the library at the University of Chicago for 3 years. And I just became enamored with the topic. And I fell in love with it after that. And that's how I fell into the field. It was just by accident. I took the right class from the right person.
So what should be a takeaway for our listeners when we think about seniors and technology?
Drop the word senior.
I agree.
And I would just say technology, and be cognizant of the importance of how these are marketed, and keep in mind that there are cohort effects, which is well known in the demographic field. Each subgroup of the population carries with them different lifetime experiences, and those that are creating or developing this technology should be cognizant of the importance of the cohort effects. In other words, the conditions under which people were raised. My grandson is being raised under a totally different set of conditions than his parents, and then her parents, and then my parents. And all you have to do is be cognizant of that. And then you can target your technology to each of those cohorts based on the lifetime experiences that they went through. And then you'll be successful in getting your technology across the age spectrum. Don't assume that just because somebody is older that they'll have a more difficult time. I would drop that completely.
I was having a difficult time when I was a lot younger, so it has nothing to do with my age.
Nothing new. Yeah, nothing new for Lee. Oh, Jay Olshansky, thank you so much for joining us again. Professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and you can follow him on Twitter. We're going to put information plus his website, put it into the show notes so you can look at the work you're doing, and really appreciate it. A great discussion, and we promise not to use the word seniors again. By the way, we're all there. We may not look it, but actually almost everybody in this call, we're pretty much all there. So
thanks for having me.
Easy segue this week into the fun fact because of our talking about age and different behaviors and technology. So 1937 Gallup poll, way back when, archived by our friends at the Roper Center at Cornell University, asked the question, do you read a daily newspaper? And in 1937, 91% of Americans said yes. Fast forward to a question that CBS News asked of a national audience again in 2019. I can't subtract the difference in my head, 63, 73, 82 years later. And the same question, do you happen to read any daily newspapers regularly or not? Similar question. 36% said yes. So surprise, surprise, 91% in a lifetime dropped to 36% in a more recent time, and I suspect the numbers are going even more so because I'm not sure the kids I have in college are reading newspapers at all right now.
But isn't this a definition of what a newspaper is? I mean, I read a daily newspaper on my iPad. It's still a newspaper, right? So, and I think the question doesn't, in 2019, they asked, do you happen to read any daily newspapers regularly or not? And I think, you might want to ask that question slightly differently, whether in person, whether on paper or in digital format. And I don't think these numbers would be so low. I don't know. That's my guess.
Well, I was actually surprised it was so high. Well, because I don't really know a lot of people who read a hard copy of a newspaper, which I think was their intention. And I think that's a really good point, Jay, that this may be a question that can be interpreted in a number of ways. So we're not actually sure what that 36% means now in 2019, but in 1937, it was very clear what that question meant.
There's so many different choices. The question does not say, do you follow information daily or hourly or by the minute, which is what the access point is now. But there's no doubt our ways of gathering information have been revolutionized with changing technology.
So Lee, I'm going to ask you, what were the most number of daily newspapers, either evening, because papers used to come in the evening too, or morning, did you read at the peak? How many did you subscribe to, or did you read, ended up on the kitchen table?
I bet I was in college. I bet I was doing 5 or 6 daily newspapers a day.
Yeah, I was never really a big newspaper reader.
But at the house, in the family?
In the family, let's see. We would get a daily newspaper and probably 1 or 2.
We got 2 in the morning, and then my dad brought home the Post, New York Post, which was an evening paper at that time. But the most I ever read was as a reporter, Times, Daily News, Post, and then New York Newsday. Newsday moved into New York City, and so I got those 4. Oh, Wall Street Journal. I got 5 every morning sitting on my doorstep, which was a little overkill because then I got on the subway like carrying more paper than I did anything else. But yeah, it is a lot easier to do all that because we still read all these, but it's a lot easier to do it on these devices now. That's for sure.
But I will say, in defense of journalism and newspapers, I mean, there's an advantage. There's an access point for local news. There's an access point for national and international news, and obviously, we've seen a lot of local papers and their newsrooms shrink as the technology has shifted, and some folks in that industry have found new ways to monetize the industry, but many haven't. And I think local news, which is so important, has really suffered in terms of the local newspapers have really suffered because these numbers have declined so much. And if they haven't found an alternative way of reaching audiences locally, then they are vanishing, and that's unfortunate. I think there's an interest in some of the big papers to rekindle the opportunities that local information sources provide for those communities, and so hopefully we might not see the answer to the question of reading daily newspapers, hard copy, increasing in the future, but we're going to see maybe a revitalization of sources of information. How's that for a little soapbox for a fun fact, guys?
Well, and I think it's important that we recognize that there's really a need for local and state reporters as well, because that's where a lot of the nitty-gritty of government and the things that actually affect our daily lives get decided. And without those folks, we are less for it.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ashley Marcinek, Athen Hollis, and Emily Fry.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.